Good morning. Welcome to the Rocky Mountain MS Center's Empower Educational Series. This series is designed to give people with MS real-life strategies to empower them to create lasting, healthy habits that will positively influence their lifelong brain health. You can look for companion articles to each of these webinars in Informs magazine, published quarterly in print and digitally through mscenter.org. The Rocky Mountain MS Center would like to thank Biogen, Bristol Myers Squibb, Genentech, and Sanofi Genzyme for their support of this program. Today's topic is living an active life with MS, physical therapy and beyond. The presentation features Dr. Mark Mañago. Dr. Mañago is an assistant professor in the physical therapy program at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus. He completed his master's, Doctor of Physical Therapy, and PhD in Rehabilitation Science, all at the University of Colorado. His specialization is neurologic physical therapy. He's a dedicated researcher focused on advancing clinical research in the field of rehabilitation in people with multiple sclerosis and other neurological conditions by investigating clinically feasible targeted exercise interventions to improve participation. He is currently leading 2 exercise trials in people with MS, one targeting core strength to improve walking, and the second looking at blood flow restriction training to improve function. If you missed something on a slide, we will be archiving this webinar on our website, www.mscenter.org, so you can replay it at any time. We'll reserve several minutes at the end to answer questions from the audience. You can submit questions at any time during the hour by typing them into the chat window on your screen. We'll answer as many questions as time allows. Today's presentation is for informational purposes only. It is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. With that, we'll turn it over to Dr. Mañago.
Thanks so much, Kelsey, for that introduction. I'm really happy to be here today. I'll just fire up my presentation here and share my screen. Okay, so today, like Kelsey said, I'm going to talk about physical therapy, but really kind of getting beyond physical therapy and what that means to kind of living an active lifestyle with MS. So the title is Living an Active Life with MS, Physical Therapy and Beyond. And I couldn't help it. I have kids who actually they're twin boys who used to dress up like Buzz and Woody like constantly. So I couldn't help by putting that in there, physical therapy and beyond. So here are the objectives for today. I want to talk about physical therapy a little bit and just kind of, remind everyone what we're here for. As Kelsey said, I am a physical therapist and I've worked a lot. Most of my practice over the 15 years I've been practicing has been probably working with people who have MS. So we'll talk about that a little bit. I'm going to present the general kind of exercise and activity recommendations. There's some guidelines published for people with MS. Many people might be familiar with those, but we'll go over those again. And then get into how community-based classes can really help to keep people active and sort of pick up where physical therapy inevitably has to leave off. Talk about monitoring steps and activities. So this is something that probably lots of you already do, but certainly is much more feasible than it used to be with modern technology. And then look at some overall kind of strategies for managing fatigue and energy, right? So that's always a tricky part about increasing your activity is how do you balance that with fatigue. And then finally, talking through some barriers to staying active and some general strategies for how you may overcome some of those barriers. So I will start with this slide and say that physical therapy really is an important part of managing an MS overall. And so hopefully most, if not all of you at some point hopefully on a regular basis see a physical therapist. I do think that is important, right? Even if you're not having a specific problem. But physical therapy is really important, certainly if you are having any specific problems. In this long list of problems, I put a few there. Most commonly we see people for things like balance and walking problems, weakness, but the list can go on, and it could be, just a regular kind of joint or back pain too that you have, and physical therapy is a good place to start with that. Physical therapy is really good, again, at addressing these specific problems, and also helping you to kind of figure out what exercises might work well for you, and specifically how they should be dosed, how you can progress those over time, how frequently you should be doing those, maybe what kind of exercise is going to be the best for you. But inevitably, physical therapy, is I guess largely from maybe insurance restrictions, but they're not, you don't go to physical therapy typically, 3 times a week for a whole year. I'm sure most people have experienced this, that physical therapy episodes tend to last 8 weeks, maybe 12 weeks, maybe a little longer with less frequent visits, but it's certainly not like a long-term year-round solution. Okay, but there has to be something else that's happening to keep up your physical activity and exercise. And so that's kind of where we're going to focus the rest of the talk. But I just wanted to remind everyone, really a lot of this should be rooted in some initial visits with your physical therapy, and maybe even kind of periodic sort of check-ins. And I certainly so I guess I'll go back to this slide. I certainly like to see people pretty regularly if I can, every year, maybe every 18 months or so, even if they're not having new problems, just to sort of do a check-in and see where everything is. So part of what we'll try to do in physical therapy is, address any specific problems, but also try to get people engaged in some sort of regular activity. And so these are what are known as the Canadian guidelines for physical activity. And this is kind of the starting point for a lot of people. And these are, there's a very small link here at the top, I realize, in terms of font, but you can find these guidelines published at this website at the top at the Canadian Society for Exercise Physiology, and you can kind of just Google them on the internet and find them pretty easily as well. But it's nothing really shocking, I guess, when you could also look at kind of the World Health Organization guidelines for physical activity, which we will look at a little bit later. So the guidelines really say to achieve fitness benefits, people with MS, and this is targeted for people who have mild to moderate disability, because it was based on literature, and unfortunately most of the literature is really focused on people who are ambulatory. And so we'll talk about other strategies for people who aren't ambulatory. But the idea is 30 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic activity twice a week, and some sort of strength training exercises for major muscle groups twice a week. Okay, so again, this is where your physical therapist can really help you decide what type of aerobic activity would be good for you. What type of strengthening, how should you be doing that, would be good for you? Are there exercises that maybe get you a little bit of both, and you can kind of just do that exercise 3-4 times a week? And there's pretty good evidence that when you kind of meet these guidelines, that there can be reductions in lots of important symptoms like fatigue and improving mobility, and enhancing lots of different areas that contribute to your quality of life. Okay, so the basics is strengthening and aerobic exercise. And so these are the guidelines continued, and they just get a little more specific in terms of dosing. Essentially, the dosing comes down to a moderate intensity. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily have to be a high intensity. And so we'll actually look at in a few more slides what that exactly means for aerobic training. But for strength training, it's kind of a dosage of being able to do 10 to 15 repetitions of a strength training exercise, and doing 2 to 3 sets of that a couple times a week. So it doesn't have to be super intense. And then it rates intensity on this scale that's commonly used to gauge intensity, which is called a Borg scale. And we'll look at the Borg scale here in a little bit, but it's kind of midway through that scale. So your heart rate's going up, but and a 5 or 6 corresponds typically with, you can sort of, you're not gasping for breath, you're not totally out of breath, and you can talk, but I wouldn't be giving this presentation if I was, exercising at a moderate intensity level. I wouldn't be able to keep up a conversation like that. So it certainly recommends also, just traditional exercises like, circuit training for weights or treadmill or a stationary bike for aerobic exercise, but it can also include other things. And again, here's where it's really useful to talk with your physical therapist about what is going to work the best for me. And particularly if walking is maybe not super efficient, maybe it's not safe, maybe it's painful. And these guidelines actually specifically mention exercises like aquatic therapy, yoga, and Tai Chi. And so, certainly there's aquatic therapy, although with the pandemic, I believe that the MS specific aquatic therapy classes that are happening are closed right now. But there are community-based classes that even target, specifically either people with MS or people with some sort of mobility disability in this community that would allow you to practice these exercises. And so, it doesn't have to be that traditional sort of go to the gym and do weights and get on the exercise bike. It can be other activities. Okay, so those are the guidelines, and I kind of maybe wanted to step back a little bit and just remind ourselves that, we always hear how important physical activity is, and I just wanted to reinforce that it really is important. Okay, and this is an article that I really like. I share with patients a lot. I think it's really approachable in terms of a scientific article. It's a review article by a great PT clinician and researcher, Deb Backus. She's at the Shepherd Center in Atlanta. And she wrote this article about increasing physical activity and participation in people with MS, and just sort of talked about a lot of the barriers that I'll cover here, but also the importance and why we need to be helping people improve their physical activity. And in that article, she cites some pretty kind of, I guess, alarming statistics about why physical therapy is so important. And as a background, there's pretty good evidence that only about 20% of people with MS get what we would consider kind of enough physical activity. So that translates to 80% of people are likely not getting enough physical activity. And we know, and she presents this really kind of simple, but I think powerful model, that when you don't get a lot of physical activity, it contributes to deconditioning. And on top of, potentially some of the other MS symptoms, this really creates this negative cycle of, you get more deconditioned and you do less physical activity, and then it just goes round and round and round. And eventually we know this also contributes to worsening disability. So the bottom line is it really is that important to do physical activity. Okay, so what is physical activity, right? Besides, walking and that strengthening exercise that we talked about. And so we talked that it doesn't have to be those two types of exercise. Physical activity could be many different things. It doesn't even have to be Tai Chi or yoga or, a formal class oftentimes. And so this is from the World Health Organization. And, they are the organization that tends to drive general physical activity recommendations. So I just wanted to go over that again, or for the first time, but kind of in context of what we recommend for MS. And they recommend 150 minutes a week of moderate intensity. So that's pretty similar to what those Canadian guidelines for MS recommend as well. So that translates to about 20 minutes a day, or 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week. So we're kind of in that 4 to 5 days a week, like we would recommend for people with MS. Or alternatively, they recommend 75 minutes of more vigorous activity. So that would translate to about 10 to 15 minutes a day, or 3 times a week for about 25 minutes. Okay. And I like this diagram. Hopefully people can see it. But just to get an idea that, again, it doesn't have to be some class or a formal program necessarily. It could include lots of different activities. But what really does matter is the intensity. So this is this Borg scale that I promised to show you. And this is how we define intensity a lot of times, even in the clinic. So there's very formal, precise ways to measure intensity, but you need to be hooked up to a treadmill or a bike and measures your oxygen output. And this scale has actually been validated pretty well against those types of measures. So we know that moderate to light activity, if you kind of rate yourself on this scale from 1 to 10, where 1 is you're really just not doing anything, like maybe just kind of sitting there. And 10 is just like you're doing as much as you can. You could barely sustain it for any amount of time. We know that when you rate yourself, say let's look just at the moderate activity, within that 4 to 6, that corresponds to sort of a moderate effort and energy expenditure. So that means that you're potentially breathing more heavily, but you can still hold, I think like I was mentioning this already, still hold a short conversation. You're pretty comfortable, but things are pretty challenging, right? You could keep doing it for a while, like 15, 20 minutes. And then when we move into vigorous activity, this is kind of getting where you're getting a little more uncomfortable in terms of your, how long you can sustain that. You're kind of short of breath. You maybe would, speak a sentence or 2 or words here and there, but you definitely would not want to carry on a conversation or be able to. And so those correspond with those vigorous activities. So if you're able to do vigorous activity, it's 75 minutes a week that the WHO recommends. And then if moderate activity is more your speed, then it's more in that 150 minutes per week for the WHO recommendations. So I told you that people with MS tend to not get enough physical activity in general, right? So when we look at lots of people who have MS altogether. So here's a study that looked at quite a few people, so over 400 people with MS with an average age of 47, and they put an activity monitor on them, so kind of like a Fitbit, I guess, but much more precise and specialized. And so you can see they word here about, I put it down here, about 14 hours a day on average, and 9 of those hours people were sedentary. And about 5 of those hours, people were participating in light activity, and about 20 minutes a day, moderate to vigorous. And then the average bout of physical activity was about 16 minutes, and the sedentary bout average was about 20 minutes, meaning they weren't moving at all. So there's just some kind of frame of reference to where a lot of people are in who have MS. I will say that the rate that people are sedentary in MS is definitely lower when you compare it to basically people who don't have MS or any other neurological disorder. So these are numbers. So people with MS on average are sedentary about 62% of the day. So that's where this line, that's what this line represents. And then what you see here, this graph is actually kind of averages for people who don't have MS or don't have any neurological problems at all. And if you compare kind of the sample I just showed you was about age 47 or so. If we compare that sedentary rate of about 62% to people, from 30 to 60, you can see it's considerably higher. So here is the percent sedentary of 60%, and you can see, generally speaking, this age range is sedentary probably in the, kind of the mid 50s percent of the time. So the point is that people are more sedentary, right, that have MS. So another way that we can measure physical activity that people are probably much more familiar with is step counts. Okay, so this is a study that looked at. Oh, I thought I had it. Sorry, I don't have the average number there. It looks like that got erased somehow. But I believe this was a sample of about 700 people with MS. And so quite a few people. And what we have here are different categories that they looked at in this study. And then the mean here is the average amount of steps people were taking. So you see, kind of ranges from as low as about 2,000 steps per day. And those are people who had MS and were using a walker, right? So that's not maybe necessarily that surprising. Maybe all the way up to 6,000 or so steps a day. And so that happened in people who had MS, but maybe had it less than 10 years. And so you can see a whole range of, relapse remitting versus progressive, people who were, weight actually didn't seem to have a big effect on step length. This was an interesting one for me. People were married or not. People who are married take a lot more steps. So you can infer what you want from that one. Employment status. But what I want you to take from this slide actually is no one here is getting 10,000 steps a day, okay? And we always hear that, right? We're inundated with 10,000, excuse me, 10,000 steps a day. Sorry about that. Everyone needs to get 10,000 steps a day. And what I wanted to maybe kind of let people know and reinforce is we don't need to necessarily be getting 10,000 steps a day, okay? Some people might know the story of that. I think there's a variety of stories of where that 10,000 steps a day threshold came from. The one that I kind of researched and found was that one of the original accelerometer kind of Fitbit companies. It wasn't Fitbit, but one of the original companies to develop the pedometer, sorry, searching for the word there, was a Japanese company, and their marketing campaign, essentially like the symbol for 10,000 also looked like someone walking. And so they picked that as kind of one of their initial marketing campaigns. And that's sort of one of those things that made it stick. It's a nice round number. It's a great number, right? If you can get to that. But there's lots of literature, like in older adults and who don't have MS, to show that, thresholds of probably 7,000 or 8,000 are plenty to sort of ward off adverse health events, right? To prevent a lot of the chronic diseases that people who advocate for 10,000 steps a day say that will prevent. So I think that's really important. And I think, as a lot of people are probably personally familiar with, it's hard to get 10,000 steps, and it just doesn't work a lot of times. And a lot of that we think is because it takes more energy to walk with MS in general, right? So some people don't have very few walking problems, but other people obviously have a lot more walking problems. But in general, when we look on average, people just with MS, it takes more energy to walk. And so you just don't need to get as many steps in many cases in order to get the same sort of benefit. And as you saw from these data here, this is again a sample of over 700 people. No one's getting anywhere close to 7,000, or to 10,000 steps a day. So, it's not to say you shouldn't target that if that's within your capability. But this is also where I like to have those kind of initial physical therapy visits to kind of try to figure out with people, what's a good target for you? If steps a day is going to be a good way that we measure your physical activity, then, what's going to be a good target for you, and how can we help you get to that? Or on the other hand, you're trying to do 10,000 steps a day, it's not working out, you're too tired to then do any of these exercises. So do we need to find some other balance? Okay. And of course, I don't necessarily have a slide on this, but hopefully everyone's aware that basically every smartphone now either tracks your steps automatically, or there's free apps that you can download that do that. So you can get a good idea if you look at your steps over a typical week, and usually the week days are a little different than the weekend, although in COVID, who knows, everything's kind of up in the air right now. But if you look at your steps over a week, you can get a pretty good idea of what your average step count is. And most of the phones and apps will even do that for you. You have these tools that can help you kind of set goals around steps and try to figure out, maybe I'm taking too much, maybe I'm not taking enough. Okay, so far we've talked about physical therapy and the importance of kind of setting up that initial exercise program and figuring out what's safe for you, what's right for you, the types of exercise, maybe how many steps you need to take. When physical therapy is over, there's lots of different ways that you can stay active through community classes, through your own kind of independent program, through walking or some other form of physical activity where you're maybe monitoring your steps, maybe you're monitoring your intensity level, and getting to those goals of either that 150 minutes per week, or at least that 4 days a week kind of strengthening and aerobic exercise. Either one of those goals is really going to help improve your physical activity, improve your overall conditioning, and contribute to improving your overall health, and actually probably preventing a progression, or helping to at least to prevent a progression of disability. Okay, so that being said, none of this is easy. None of it is easy, right? That goes without saying, but we will talk a lot about it right now. So these are the two biggest barriers for exercise in people with MS. It's been shown over and over again. Certainly there's lots of other barriers, but fatigue and time, right, are the biggest barriers. And so I think certainly time is the biggest barrier for probably everybody with or without MS for doing exercise. But unique to MS is this fatigue, right? So there's two different types of fatigue that I'll kind of just want to go over. One is what we call self-reported fatigue. So this is that fatigue that just is that one that's really hard to describe, that's very unique to MS, that is not necessarily improved through sleep or caffeine or anything like that. Many of you can probably describe it much better than I just did, but it's what you feel. It doesn't necessarily change with activity, although it can. And then the other type of fatigue that we talk about is performance fatigue, or fatigability. And this is the fatigue where you're doing a repeated task and you get worse at it, or it gets more tiring as you go on. So walking is a repeated task because you're just moving your legs over and over again. And so, you might start out walking and that first block is great. The second block is a little slower. And that third block, you got to sit down. And that would be more what we would call fatigability. So there's different strategies to manage both, okay? So general suggestions and kind of ideas to help overcome these common barriers. One thing that you can think about is exercise and activity, physical activity in intervals. So you don't have to, do your 150 minutes a week of moderate activity in half-hour bouts 5 days a week. You can do them in 10-minute bouts. And do that 3 times a day and space them out as much as you want, okay? So there's a little more benefit of stringing them together and getting it all done at once, but not that much. It really does matter, that total time. It doesn't necessarily matter how you structure it. So that can really help with both that self-reported fatigue, but really particularly with that fatigability, okay? thinking about the time of day you exercise. I mean, I know that sounds really basic, but I think, you know, and then this goes along with the next point, planning that into your day, right? And I'm guilty of this as well. I always talk about it with people, like, put that block in your calendar where you're going to exercise, and don't schedule over it. Don't you know, kind of like, oh, I can schedule over that because it's just my exercise. No, that's really important. And particularly when you have fatigue and you might have better parts of the day, you might want to pick that time, obviously, you're going to get the most benefit, and it's going to be the least difficult time for you to do. So that can be really important. Simple strategy, hard to follow through with, but can be done. Other helpful tips I find with people, generally speaking, is to make reasonable goals. So again, this could relate to, gosh, I feel like I need to get that 30 minutes in, and I want to do it all at once. And maybe that's just not reasonable. So you're going to break it up into 10-minute bouts or less if that's what you need to do. Also, you know, when it relates to the steps, like I talked about, you know, getting to that 10,000, maybe getting to that 7,000 even, is just not a realistic goal for you. And so taking small steps, it can be really important. Peer and family support is also really important. So, you know, if others around you aren't supportive of your goals, or, you know, maybe contribute to you being less active, that can make things much more difficult. So, you know, that becomes a little more difficult if it's the family, especially the family you live with. But peer groups can be really important to help you stay accountable, but also motivated to continue to work out or exercise. And then your providers are another important part of this, right? So, you know, I know all our neurologists and providers at the Rocky Mountain MS Center really encourage physical activity and exercise. But, you know, at the same time, they I think encourage it and definitely want you to do it. But I think then, you know, the next step is bringing it to your physical therapist and making sure you really talk about that as a goal, and help design ways to do that. I don't think every physical therapist is kind of necessarily focused on that big picture, but I think if you bring it up, and that it's important to you, that they definitely know how to help you kind of set and make these goals to increase your overall physical activity. So fatigue. So fatigue is, again, a huge problem in MS. It's often kind of cited as the most common symptom and most universal symptom in MS. We talked about some strategies in terms of exercise, but there's lots of other ways to kind of try to manage fatigue. You know, some of these relate to some of the points I just covered in terms of setting goals and managing your goals, identifying barriers. Maybe there's other barriers that get in the way of your fatigue, and motivational factors. So this is, I think, where a lot of times these peer groups can be really important, and kind of hearing what other people's experiences are and what other people have done to help manage fatigue in this way. And also with problem solving. So, right, trying to figure out ways throughout your day sometimes to just make it more efficient, where you're not spending as much energy, and therefore you have more energy for other things. And that kind of goes along also with the prioritization. So there's been quite a bit of research on self-management of fatigue, and one way people have talked about doing it is through education. So and teaching people how to manage fatigue through these energy conservation techniques. And so, you know, a big part of fatigue for anyone, but certainly this is important for MS. And I think this series has had some talk about diet, but health and kind of diet and a balanced lifestyle really does contribute to fatigue. And so kind of optimizing that is really important. Rest throughout the day can be key. So, you know, just trying to push through until you can't do any more tends to be worse than if you take some time before you hit the wall to rest throughout the day. body mechanics and ergonomics. It seems kind of basic, but it really does contribute to fatigue. So how efficiently you do things. So that's anything from lifting and kind of, daily chores in the house to even just how we're all now sitting at our desks all day. And paying attention to those mechanics can actually contribute to improving your fatigue. Environment modification, this tends to mean kind of setting up your work or home in a way where you might just spend less energy doing your day-to-day tasks, right? So, this might be, I'm trying to think of an example of a task like laundry, where you're not, running up and down the stairs 3 or 4 times and getting different loads of laundry, and you kind of just have a more streamlined process, or maybe change the way the way you kind of organize and do that task in order to make it less fatiguing. Heating and cooling strategies, right? So we know that when people overheat, a lot of people have that heat sensitivity, that can really make a difference. And then we talked a little bit about this already, and this is where you probably want to talk through with a provider like a physical therapist is, what are you doing in terms of activity? And maybe actually need to start taking fewer steps, get more exercise, and that's the right balance for you. There's other more specific areas that I'm just going to breeze over because I'm definitely not an expert in these areas. So cognitive behavioral therapy is been looked at a lot. And so a lot of this stuff is delivered by a psychologist to help manage fatigue, mindfulness-based stress reduction as well. And again, these are tools that are typically done by a psychologist, but they're starting to get, especially this year, more online resources for this. And so there's this great website, My MS Toolkit, which is founded, it's a free toolkit, I believe, and it's founded by a group from the University of Michigan, and it can be a great way to get some introduction to some of these principles. We know that things like depression and anxiety are linked really strongly with fatigue, not just in MS, but kind of generally speaking, but definitely in MS. We don't necessarily know that improving one or the other improves fatigue necessarily, but certainly it just highlights the importance of bringing these problems up with your providers, making sure they're aware of them and treating them when appropriate, and that can have an effect on fatigue. Okay, so there's obviously lots of other symptoms besides fatigue, although fatigue tends to come up a lot in these talks. But it's important, I think, to also track your other symptoms in terms of facilitating your ability to do more physical activity. So we talked about kind of looking at steps, but tracking sleep can be really important. Obviously, sleep and not getting enough sleep would contribute to fatigue, but also can make physical activity harder. And then, if you get really kind of specific, but again, there's lots of technology that does this really easily, like the Apple Watch now, that looks at your vital signs. So everything from heart rate and oxygenation. Now that I think the Apple Watch, can look at your heart rhythm even. So tracking a lot of those symptoms, on one side can be very motivating for people, but it can also help monitor your intensity and how much activity you're getting. And it can also help, I think one thing is you maybe start a new exercise program and you might feel like it triggers some other symptoms that you have with MS. And so tracking those symptoms carefully can help you kind of make those links, I think, and then adjust your activity program based on that. And so the MS Society it's a pretty basic tool. I think it's mostly just a paper tool that you can download, but it's nicely organized in order to kind of help manage some of your symptoms. But there's also apps that do that as well. And there's too many to list, but you can kind of search for kind of symptom tracking apps for sure. And then some other symptoms, just quickly to go over here at the end, I want to try to wrap up in the next minute or two, is, we know that cognition and sort of people that have any type of cognitive impairment that can contribute to less activity or to being more unsafe with activity. And so if that's the case, you really need to think about, when I do my exercise or activity, I'm just really going to be focused on that. I'm not going to be distracted by doing other things. Same thing with people who have any type of visual disturbances, or sometimes this can present like dizziness. Is just considering where you're doing your activity. Look at the lighting, at kind of the background and the busyness of the environment can really influence how you tolerate that activity. We talked a little bit about heat sensitivity and looking at cooling strategies as well. This always comes up. I think it's a big one, especially, when you're talking about going to a gym or going out for a longer walk. There's lots of potential problems that people have, mostly with bladder incontinence and just spasticity, that can make it stressful, to say the least. To think about going to the gym and, what do I do if I have to go to the bathroom quickly? And so that's definitely a consideration, and you wanna have a plan so it doesn't create stress around that. I also did want to plug that PT can be quite effective if you see a pelvic floor specialist. And we do have those at University Hospital for improving bladder function. And then sensory problems, MS can come with sensory problems which make balance difficult. And so just, being aware of that. And, if you need canes or walking poles or different shoes or braces to make a physical activity program easier, it's absolutely worth it to prevent falls, because falls can be so devastating. And then some other barriers that come along with exercise. These are from that article by Deb Backus that I was citing before. I just kind of wanted to sort of briefly present these. We've talked about a lot of these things, but certainly resources and costs doesn't have to be costly to do exercise and activity, but it can come up as a barrier, and the use and interpretation of all these different guidelines. And so I think that's where, taking this to your physical therapist and really working on a plan can be really important, and kind of the real foundation of getting you into a lifelong habit of physical activity. All right, so that's really all I have. I also wanted to sort of plug a couple studies that I have going on. So we're like Kelsey mentioned, we're doing a core strengthening study. Everything's unfortunately but appropriately on hold right now, but we hope to be picking up by maybe February of next year. So we're looking at some core strengthening in people with MS and people who are ambulatory. And then we're also going to start a study that's going to look at blood flow restriction training. So it's kind of a newer technology to improve strength in people with MS. And actually, this study is going to be people who need assistance to walk and people who are using manual wheelchairs only. So it kind of runs the spectrum of MS there. And then I think let's take some questions. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Excellent. Thank you so much. If you have a question to submit, please do so now using the chat window, the Q&A function on your screen. We did have a number of questions that were submitted during registration, so I can start us off with some of those. We had a number of questions that were relating to specific exercises for things like a herniated disc, or I don't have use of my right side, I'm in a wheelchair, getting in and out of a vehicle, those very specific questions. So I thought we could address those first.
Yeah, I appreciate all those. It's hard to answer those, obviously, without seeing a person and talking to them at least a little more in detail about that. So I think for all those types of very specific questions, hopefully that came across in the first few slides. That's really the role of the physical therapist in this whole big picture. Is like, I got back pain, and the physical therapist might not be the one that's going to sort of cure the back pain, but plugs you into the system that that can help manage that. And then when you manage that, it's kind of then what do you, what are the plans for exercise moving forward? Or, I'm in a manual wheelchair and have paralysis on one side. The physical therapist is there to sort of like, let's figure out some exercises that, would work for you. That's not going to look like, typical walking or Tai Chi or any of those things I mentioned, but we can figure out something that would work. So that's where I do think that it's really important to connect with your PT. And I know it's a little harder these days, especially in these next maybe couple months. But even for a lot of those cases, the telehealth options can work pretty well. So I'd encourage you to even not shy away from that telehealth option. It's not ideal by any means, but it's better than not connecting, I think.
And I'm hoping that these questions will be a little more general and a little less specific, but recommendations, thoughts on adapting exercises. Can most exercise be adapted to sitting, and kind of general leg weakness, general improving walking thoughts?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, yes, the short answer is yes. I mean, I think exercise, and again, this is really where PTs excel, can be adapted to almost any scenario, right? There are, there are community-based sort of programs that do like, I'm trying to think of the program at the rec centers, the Silver Sneakers programs. They have different kind of sit and be fit, I think they call them, exercise classes or chair yoga type classes, or working with your PT directly to sort of figure out a program. And then there's exercise equipment really that, that some rec centers have at least, that doesn't require you to stand, where you can be sitting the whole time and getting even aerobic exercise. So I think there's lots of different options for that.
Excellent. And I would also like to plug the MS Center has put out a couple of videos with another physical therapist, Michelle Harrison, specifically doing some seated exercises and seated stretching that we've put out over the last couple of months. So we'll link to those in the chat box as well.
Yes, I would recommend those as well. So I often send people to her pool classes, and although those aren't happening right now, but
she's doing an online version.
Right, an online pool class. I've heard that. Yes.
Yep. So yeah, we are keeping people moving.
That's great.
I know you talked a lot about fatigue already in the presentation. If you could kind of sum up, we had a couple of different questions related to really, how do I get started when fatigue is my problem? I know we talked a lot about kind of how you manage fatigue in order to work out, but
yeah,
starting point.
I think when fatigue is like the limiting factor, and so this is probably what we would call that self-reported fatigue, is just that all-encompassing fatigue. I think when it's that severe that it's just hard to get started, I do think that's where some of those more specialized interventions that maybe sometimes come from psychologists, like the cognitive behavioral therapy, the mindfulness-based things, really are one of the better places to start. Because you're right, if you just can't get started, then a lot of those strategies that I talked about aren't as helpful. So for that, I think then the other starting place for that, even kind of before the psychologist, is really trying to have that conversation with your primary, like, your neurologist. And, because there's lots of different routes, whether it's medication or, the cognitive behavioral and psychology care. Sometimes it's addressing other problems that you might not have thought contributing to fatigue, like depression or anxiety. I do think that kind of addressing those in those ways can be the most effective.
We had a question. Are you currently looking for volunteers to participate in those studies that you mentioned?
We are. So I put the email for Emily Hager on that last slide, and so I think those will be available to you. And we're not enrolling quite. We had to pause enrollment, but we'll be picking up the latest by hopefully March, but hopefully in February. So yeah, that's awesome.
And for everyone who is watching live or registered, we will be emailing out this presentation as well as the various links that have been mentioned. So you will have access to those. Question on ways to monitor for cardio and aerobics while taking a beta blocker and using a collator to ambulate, rollator, sorry.
Yeah, so it's a good question, because the beta blocker, I think, is what you're getting at. It sort of, it will blunt your heart rate response, so you're not going to monitor that activity in that way. So that's where I think the Borg scale that I presented can be really helpful. So it's really just based on effort. So how hard you're breathing. Of course, also making sure that that's safe with whoever prescribed you that beta blocker, and how hard you should be exercising. But the monitoring in that way can be really, really accurate. So it's a good way to do it. It's much easier than trying to do the heart rate to begin with.
And do you have suggestions for dealing with spasms while weight training?
Yeah, so spasticity is something I didn't bring that one up, because that definitely can be a big barrier. So stretching can be a temporary way to manage spasms. So sometimes that would need to be frequent, like if you're doing particularly pretty heavy weights. That could trigger the spasticity between sets even, and you might have to hold them like while you're resting, almost, stretching for the 45, 60 seconds in between sets. That can help if there's obviously medication that can help manage spasticity, and that's really the best way to do it. Not everyone responds that well, but that could be another one. And certainly baclofen is something that you could talk with your neurologist, but I know with working with these neurologists, at least from the Rocky Mountain MS Center, that they're pretty open about people kind of typically experimenting with baclofen in the sense of like, oh, okay, I'll take it before exercise, and maybe that'll help manage the spasticity. And so, but definitely talking to another neurologist about that.
You mentioned the Silver Sneakers program and chair yoga. Have you heard of any programs using boxing training for MS?
I have heard about those boxing training programs. I actually read a study about a kickboxing program, but I think it was done in Ohio. But to be honest, I don't know who does that. I know there's a Punch for Parkinson's program, so for people with Parkinson's disease, but I'm not sure. I don't know that you have to have Parkinson's. It's in a normal boxing gym. I don't know the name off the top of my head, but that's what I would start, is maybe just Googling the Punch for Parkinson's program. And I know it's held in a boxing gym. And so they might have also programs for other populations.
I know you discussed kind of at length the various potential time recommendations and kind of breaking it up between aerobic and strength training, but we did have a question about if you have 20 minutes a day, what are exercise priorities for someone with MS?
Well, I hope it wasn't too confusing, because I presented, that sort of the strengthening and aerobic stuff that are kind of MS specific guidelines, and then the general physical activity guidelines for the World Health Organization. So, and it really will depend. And again, your physical therapist really can help you with this. If you have weakness of any kind, and not everyone does, but if you do, then those MS specific guidelines are maybe more important, because you want to get aerobic for sure, but you definitely want to at least try to maintain strength. So I think that's important. So I guess, if you had 30 minutes a day, it would leave you time to maybe do aerobic training a couple times a week, and then also potentially do some strength training a couple times a week. But that being said, it's also any physical activity whatsoever. So if you're doing 5 days a week of aerobic or 5 days a week of strength training, is infinitely better than none. So if you're just following the WHO guidelines in that way too, it's definitely going to still be beneficial.
Awesome. I think that is an excellent place for us to end. So I just want to thank you, Dr. Mañago, for your time. And thank you guys, everyone who tuned in and submitted questions. So thanks and have a great day.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, and thanks for the great questions.